Hi, everybody. Welcome to Exploring Sunday Scriptures for August 15th. And these are the scriptures associated with this coming Sunday, August the 20th, 2023. As I've said in the previous couple of weeks, we are anchored right now in the lectionary, a 3-year cycle of readings that moves us through the majority of the major stories and important events of the biblical narrative. Old Testament, so the story of God's journey with the Israelite or Hebrew people. New Testament, the story of God's journey with the early church, primarily through Paul's letters. And Gospel, the story of Jesus and his life and ministry, miracles and teachings. So what I like about the lectionary, as I said last week, in these green Sundays, is it tends to be very sequential, or it tends to be very chronological. So stories are following an order where we're picking up more or less where we left off the previous week. That means as we journey through this, as we do it week by week, we're getting these small snapshots and get to appreciate them as small snapshots as we also kind of get the larger story as a whole over time. I encourage you, if you're compelled by any of these, that you might read more, whether that be reading back and what leads up to the events that we hear today and then reading beyond, or perhaps the whole thing. So we've been, for example, journeying with Abram and Sarai, who become Abraham and Sarah, as they then have their children, Ishmael by their servant woman, Hagar, and then eventually Jacob by Sarah. And then Jacob, after his wrestling in the woods, becomes Israel. Israel has a bunch of children, Joseph being his last. And last week we had Joseph's brothers very jealous. There's a whole backstory with Jacob and Rachel and how he had to have other wives, and it's complicated and messy. Rachel was the woman he always wanted to marry, and then there was trouble finally when they were able to be married with conception. Anyway, so we have Joseph sold off into slavery by his brothers, and as I pointed out last week, I found it really interesting that you have brothers or stepbrothers separated prior, so Ishmael and Jacob, that kind of come back together in 2 generations, 1 generation removed, is now you have Joseph, Jacob's child, and this tribe of Ishmaelites, which most likely would have been Ishmael's children, who buy Joseph from his brothers and take him with them down to Egypt. So sort of a reunion of families, though not recognized, was an interesting twist last week that if I had to preach on that text, perhaps I might discuss things such as all that we divide and separate and push away. In the case of Abraham, it was Sarah whose jealousy for Hagar and Ishmael, and eventually her conception with Jacob, leads her to ask Abraham to push Hagar and Ishmael away. And now, despite you might say the human inclination or the human best efforts to separate and divide, so our journeys continue to bring us back together. And that is God's ultimate hope for the world, is harmony, a reunion of the one human family. So we're continuing with that story. We jump on ahead. Last week we were in the 37th chapter. Now we're in the 45th chapter. But we're catching up with Joseph with what's happened after he's gone down to Egypt. And that's where we're picking up the story in the Old Testament. And I'll say a little bit about New Testament and Gospel as we get to those 2 readings as well. So here's Genesis 45, verses 1 through 15. For this week, August 20th, it's the day of our worship, 2023. Then Joseph could no longer control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried out, "Send everyone away from me." So no one stayed with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard it. And Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, so dismayed were they at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Come closer to me." And they came closer. And he said, I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are 5 more years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. He has made me a father to Pharaoh and lord of all his house and ruler over all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, Thus says your son Joseph, God has made me lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall settle in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, you and your children's children, as well as your flocks, your herds, and all that you have, and I will provide for you there, since there are 5 more years of famine to come, so that you and your household and all that you have will not come to poverty. And now your eyes and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see that it is my own mouth that speaks to you. You must tell my father how greatly I am honored in Egypt, and all that you have seen. Hurry and bring my father down here. And he fell upon his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, while Benjamin wept upon his neck. And he kissed all his brothers and wept upon them. And after that, his brothers talked with him. There's a whole backstory to this that we really need to go back and read through. So we left off at the 37th chapter. Here we're picking up in the 45th chapter. And what's happened between is that Joseph is sold off as a servant in Egypt, which there, because of this, now his brothers called him a dreamer, because of his ability to kind of interpret dreams, he comes to understand that famine is going to come on the land. And so the rulers of Egypt at that time, the Pharaoh at that time, laid up stores in order that it wouldn't distress Egypt. And as it comes to pass, so Jacob's stature rises in the eyes of those in power, in the eyes of Pharaoh, because of this capability of interpreting dreams and ultimately securing their welfare and their future. In the midst of that, because this famine has come over the land, so Joseph's brothers, one particularly, end up coming down to Egypt in order to sort of, get supplies, if you will. And you can read the backstory there. Joseph recognizes the brother, but does not reveal himself in that first visit, but asks that all the brothers be brought back. And that's ultimately what we have here, is this revelation ultimately of his identity, that he is okay. And maybe for his brothers who did something very rash out of their own ignorance as well as their own jealousy, have had to live with that, to sit with it, not knowing what happened, assuming perhaps their brother was dead, that they would never see their brother again. And so in some ways you have this pseudo-resurrection where someone they assumed was gone forever has now appeared before them. And it's got to be somewhat unbelievable for them. Now, both parties, Joseph, who had this happen to him, and his brothers, in this case it talks about Benjamin, end up, with these tears of joy, this unbelief, because Joseph himself had to have a sense that perhaps he was never going to see his birth family again, particularly his father, let alone his brothers. And so you have this reunion, which is a happy reunion, while also a sad one. Some of these tears are ones of grief over what's happened. I would think that the brothers particularly are struggling with some of that grief of having sold him off and what's happened. Now, all of that leads to the fact that this is going to secure for them a safe place to endure what is now befallen the land. And Joseph is interpreting this as part of God's story. And so it wasn't his brothers that did the harm, but this was God's doing, or preordained by God to be. Now, I'm not going to get into the theology of where God steers us, but I think sometimes retrospectively, when we think about hardships and difficult events in our lives, we sometimes can look back and see how they led us to perhaps better places eventually. And that may be really hard to believe in the moment, But perhaps retrospectively, we look back and think, well, where God closed a door, I've heard this expression before, he also opened a window, or where one way was shut, so another one opened. Does God preordain those things to happen? Well, I'm not sure I can get behind a grand puppeteer that's up there pulling strings and selling people off into slavery. But sometimes it is about our journey with God in faith, knowing that even amid the hardship, God is with us, provided that we stay true to that faith, which Joseph did. So maybe more of his story is about his steadfastness in faith, that he didn't sink as the wind and waves were against him. I know that's last week's gospel. But that's a little theological interpretation. Now let me shift over to the Romans reading. And here Paul has been he's been writing for some amount of time to the Christians in Rome about the status of the Jewish people, the Israelite people. Because there were a lot of questions in early Christianity of whether one needed to become Jewish in order to be Christian. And they were valid questions. Jesus was a first century Palestinian Jew. His ministry was to the Jews there in Israel and the surrounding countryside. And so there's some sense of, do we need to follow all of the rules of Judaism? And Paul has been writing about how those things are no longer necessary. He uses himself sometimes as an example of someone who was a Jew but now looks at that and sees that as unnecessary, particularly for those Gentiles who didn't follow that way before. And he's trying to defend or explain that, as well as answer questions that may be asked in retort if he was in a conversation. So one of the questions that comes up is, okay, if none of those things matter anymore, does it mean that God doesn't care about or has cast aside the Jewish people? Is God now said, nope, you're not my people anymore, now only the Christian people are my people? And that's kind of where Paul is picking up the argument. So he asks rhetorical questions and answers them, and it's kind of a form of conversation and speech and writing that you find within this time period that is expressed through his writings, particularly here in the epistle to the Christians in Rome. It's a very short passage. We have verses 1 and 2, the first half of 2, and the verses 29 through 32. And this is what he writes there. I ask then, has God rejected his people? By no means. I myself am an Israelite, a descendant of Abraham, a member of the tribe of Benjamin. God has not rejected his people whom he foreknew. For the gifts and the calling of God are irrevocable. Just as you were once disobedient to God, but have now received mercy because of their disobedience, so they have now been disobedient in order that, by the mercy shown to you, they too may now receive mercy. For God has imprisoned all in disobedience, so that he may be merciful to all. So the idea here is that all of us are subject to God's forgiveness, to God's mercy. And no one is above that, no matter their background or what rules they've been following. And in fact, all have been disobedient or have not followed God's ways completely. And so it's only God that really can provide the pathway by grace ahead in our journey and in our relationship with God. So again, you have sort of a universality expressed by Paul, which he does in other places where he says, neither Jew nor Greek, slave nor free, male nor female, all are one in Christ Jesus. That's continued to be expressed here, is all of ourselves are at the mercy of God, and no one is differentiated from that, no matter their background. And so it's not as though there is one who has been rejected and one who has been accepted, but rather all have fallen short of God. And so all are at God's mercy to receive forgiveness for that. Now we pick up with Jesus' journey after they have been across those waters. They've been calmed. They've claimed Jesus as Lord. They're continuing their journey. So no more boats now. They're walking on the land when we pick up the story. And what has happened as they walked along is the disciples had been picking the heads of grain off as they walked along and put it in their mouths, but they didn't wash their hands first. And in Jewish culture at that time, before you could eat, there was this ritual washing of your hands. Now we know that good hygiene is very, very important, and that washing your hands keeps you from getting sick. But what had happened in Jewish culture is this had become a sign in some ways of religiousness, of connection to God. And so, quite frankly, they were just trying to meet their basic needs. And so eating with their hands as they walked along. No, they had not dipped them into the water pots. And we might think of the first miracle in the Gospel of John, which is the changing of water into wine. And those water pots there that became wine were for this action, which we could question whether it really actually did clean the hands, that is, to make them sanitary and ready to eat with, and really had just become an exercise and religious expression and not really something about hygiene. And so the Pharisees had accused them. How can he let them walk along and eat with defiled hands? And Jesus uses this as a teaching moment, which is where we pick up the story now. Then Jesus called the crowd to him and said to them, "Listen and understand. It is not what goes into the mouth that defiles a person, but it's what comes out of the mouth that defiles." Then the disciples approached and said to him, "Do you know that the Pharisees took offense when they heard what you said?" And Jesus answered, "Every plant that my heavenly Father has not planted will be uprooted. Let them alone. They are blind guides of the blind. And if one blind person guides another, both will fall into a pit." Peter said to him, "Explain this parable to us." Then he said, "Are you also still without understanding? Do you not see that whatever goes into the mouth enters the stomach and goes out into the sewer? But what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart. And this is what defiles. For out of the heart comes evil intentions, murder, adultery, fornication, theft, false witness, slander. These are what defile a person. But to eat with unwashed hands does not defile." Jesus left that place and went away to the district of Tyre and Sidon. Just then a Canaanite woman from that region came out and started shouting, "Have mercy on me, Lord, Son of David. My daughter is tormented by a demon." But he did not answer her at all, and his disciples came and urged him, saying, "Send her away, for she keeps shouting after us." He answered, "I was sent only to the lost sheep of the house of Israel." But she came and knelt before him, saying, "Lord, help me." He answered, "It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs." She said, "Yes, Lord, yet even the dogs eat the crumbs that fall from their master's table." And then Jesus answered her, "Woman, great is your faith. Let it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed instantly. So we really have two incidences here. And the lectionary puts these together. And really the lectionary tacks on the first passage, the one about defiled hands, and the focus is supposed to be the second passage. Now, most clergy would prefer, and I think most of us listening would prefer not to hear that second passage, because this ranks up among those things that we wish that Jesus hadn't said. He calls this woman some pretty harsh things, at least by our ears, doesn't seem to have mercy upon her or compassion as shown in so many other places. He's fed 5,000 plus the women and children, so we might assume 10, 15,000 people. Here's one person asking for mercy, asking for compassion, and he's willing to turn a blind eye. It's really difficult for us to understand. And so we need to spend a little bit of time with it. I think I unpacked the first half of this passage before I went into it, but it does really share with us that those things which are true of us come from our hearts. And so when we speak harshly about anyone, it comes from our hearts. When we think poorly about anybody, it comes from our hearts, from our core, from who we are. And so it doesn't matter what food we eat. That does not define who we are as a person. What defines us as a person is ultimately what we do and what we say, and even what we don't say and what we don't do say a lot about who we are. That's really Jesus's primary teaching. And it's, I think, really easy to understand and potent always. And I think of this frequently. I know I've shared this before when I'm in traffic and I get so aggravated that those people that I'm getting aggravated with, as I may think and sometimes say things concerning those who I feel are not acting appropriately in their vehicles as we drive, that is somebody's son, daughter, mother, father, grandmother, grandfather. That is a sacred child of God. And I need to see all people in that way, including in the car. And so we really can, I think, understand this passage really, really well. It's the second half where we struggle. Now, a Canaanite woman would have been somebody who was not viewed favorably by Jews. They were outside of those who were included as part of the Jewish community. Now, Jesus in his ministry has been pretty explicit that his ministry is to the lost sheep of Israel. And so he's not being intentionally cruel to her. He is trying to fulfill what he sees as his ministry. After Jesus' resurrection and the gift of the Holy Spirit, the ministry expands beyond the lost sheep of Israel to all. But in the life of Jesus, there is a finiteness. He's only one individual, and so his ministry is very specific, and he has been very explicit about that specificity. But we have somebody who is outside those lost sheep of Israel. And remember, Canaan of Galilee was where Abraham had come to settle long, long ago. So there's an interesting link to the Old Testament there. But she came out from that region, and she is identifying him by identity, Lord. She calls him Lord twice. Now, this is significant because most are still kind of not completely understanding Jesus's full identity as Lord. And here she is, somebody who is outside of the fold of the lost sheep of Israel, who clearly recognizes who he is fully. And that may be a piece of why he doesn't recognize her. One of the pieces. The other piece is that clearly he has also come to be seen as a miracle worker. So as she recognizes his capability because of his identity, she's approaching him to answer a personal issue. A demon is tormenting my daughter. Now, this could mean any number of things. We might call it psychological distress or some sort of disorder that we would have a word for now. Or it could have literally been a demon as they viewed them at that time. So I don't want to diminish those evil impulses that perhaps did exist. Now, at first, he simply chooses not to recognize her. He sees beyond her, which feels like one of the harshest things you can do is just not to recognize a person, to see them. And Jesus has been so good in his ministry at seeing people, individuals of sacred worth, people that had been disregarded by the community. Jesus has reached out and touched and held and included in even his small band of followers as his disciples. And so here comes somebody who recognizes who he is and the power that he has, and the first thing he does is he chooses not even to recognize her. Now that could be because he doesn't want to get bound up into this miracle worker status. And this might go back to some of the temptations at the beginning of Jesus's ministry. As he's got all this power, it could be easy to simply revel in that and become very self-centered and power hungry, or I don't know what you want to call it. Jesus is fully human and fully divine, right? So those temptations are there. And so perhaps looking past her is not really being intentionally cruel, but trying to keep himself in check that he doesn't become himself journey down the wrong path as he understands his own ministry. And again, that ministry he sees as to the lost sheep of Israel. So he looks past her, feels cruel in our mind, but perhaps there was some good reasoning behind it. We don't have that in the text, so I'm being really interpretive here with it. He doesn't say anything, but his disciples say, she's annoying us. Come on, send her away. So while Jesus looks past, the disciples can't stop from hearing and ultimately being annoyed by it. So they kind of become the culprits in some ways of what will be the answer to the prayer. And this again is where he answers, and he's answering both them and her. Send her away. And he said, well, I came to serve the lost sheep of Israel. So this is the explanation for why I'm not recognizing you. She comes closer to him, says, Lord, help me, which I think is the most powerful statement here, is it moves from the direct request, which remains, but the second recognition or the second confession of his identity, and ultimately seeking out his compassion. Now he answered, this is the one that I think really is difficult for us. It's not fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. He is essentially calling her a dog. Now, dogs were ritually unclean. They were used for service work, but never allowed in the house. And so throwing it to the dogs is a way of saying, you can't take what is intended for somebody else and prepared for somebody else and give it away to someone it wasn't intended for. It is really still an ethnic slur. It's really difficult. Jesus was a product of his time, a product of his own family. There could be some things in here, again, Jesus fully human, fully divine, that we see him wrestling with that. And she says, yeah, but even some scraps fall from the master's table. Even the master has compassion on those that help in service to the master. And this is where Jesus has his own eyes, you might say, or his own ministry expanded. Now, is it Jesus who has expanded this, or is this a teaching moment as the disciples are like, hey, send her away? And so this exchange is a way for him to begin to help them with what their ministry is going to be, which is beyond the lost sheep of Israel into the wider world. Now, this is the 15th chapter of Matthew. So it's a very good hypothesis that this sits where it does as a way to begin to expand the ministry, what will become the ministry of the early church, of the apostolic church. As we're getting close in Matthew's gospel to where everything is going to pivot towards Jerusalem and the events that happen in Jerusalem. Jesus, the crucifixion of Jesus, and ultimately the resurrection of Jesus, leading to the expansion of the ministry of Jesus in the apostolic church. It's still a difficult thing to wrestle with, and I think for all of us, what it asks of us is to check carefully our own preconceptions about any other cultures or peoples that are out there, be it another religion, another race, another part of the world, another language, I don't know, whatever it may be that often informs us before we can really see a person as a person. And see in this that there is a pivot that can happen when we get past our own preconceptions, as we get past our own globalization of a peoples into seeing a person and can meet them where they are at. And in so doing, they can have an encounter with God and we can have an encounter with God. Still a difficult passage to wrestle with. Those are our three passages for this week. Again, that's Genesis 45, verses 1 through 15, Romans chapter 11, verses 1 through 2a and 29 through 32, and Matthew chapter 15, verses 10 through 28. I look forward to worshiping with you on this Sunday as we seek out the Holy Spirit's guidance for inspiration and understanding on these passages. God bless you.